Okay, so we did our project on honeybees, which was entitled Controlling the Impact of the Managed Honeybee on Wild Bees and Protected Areas. Haley, myself, and Zach created this project together. All right, so some background information as to why they did this study. So the main purpose of this study was to see the impacts of introducing managed honeybees into a population of wild bees that were pre-existing into the location where they brought the honeybees into, to see the kind of effects, negative and positive, that it would have on nectar and pollen production. So they really wanted to study if adding honeybees would affect the overall competition. So for example, in fields with large amounts of forage and foliage, competition was more fierce. In contrast, fields containing fewer amounts of forage had less competition between. Okay, so hypothesis. How does the introduction of new bees into a pre-existing population affect the area and the bees? So they basically wanted to test, would this make the bees, would the more competition and the foreign bees create more pollen production and more nectar production, or would it decrease the amount of pollen and nectar production? All right, so some controls, what stayed the same was the volume of bees, how many bees were already there, and how many bees they brought into the location. The location was the same. They were all within this same area, the Rosemary Mediterranean scrubland in southern France. And they also wanted to keep the amount of bees in each area consistent. So they didn't want too many wild bees or too many of the honeybees in the area. They kind of wanted the percentage of each one to be the same. And then the amount of area set of bees was expected to cover. So how much area was the bee, were the set of bees supposed to cover as a whole? So the independent variables, the things that the researchers changed, was the amount of foliage in each location. So they basically had control over that. Were they going to give them too many trees and flowers and plants to pollinate, or were they going to give them too little? The distance between apiaries, and the apiaries are where bees live. So the distance between the bees' apiaries between one another, so the wild bees and the honeybees. The placement of the apiaries, how close or how far away they were from the foliage and the forage that they would be getting their pollen and nectar from. And then the size of the apiary, how big or small it would be for each location. So the dependent variables, what's being measured, was the foraging competition. They wanted to see, was it competitive between the wild bees and the honeybees. The bee production, how much they were producing, how much nectar they were producing, how much pollen they were producing, and overall how much honey they were producing. The foraging success, how successful were they when they were going out and collecting pollen. The pollination production, how well were the plants producing pollen, and how well were the bees gaining the pollen. And the honey production, how much honey were the bees making in each location. All right, so some results. The hypothesis was supported by the study of the new population of existing bee habitats, the population affecting the area and the bees. The competition between the bees causes a 50% decrease in foraging and pollination rates for 600 range of the apiaries. This study shows the effect of the surrounding environment when the bee population exceeds the threshold capacity. So basically, they saw what happens when you bring in too many bees to a location. Not enough honey was produced because there was too much competition. So basically, when there are too many bees and too much foliage or forage, not enough honey can be made because of the large amount of competition. All right, so what they concluded, that it shows negative effects of placing excess bees in a given location, and they proved the bee competition between pre-existing population and introduced bees. So like I said before, it was basically a competition between the two bees. They didn't know each other and they weren't familiar with each other, so it was more of a competition between the two types of bees and the amount of honey that they produced overall and the amount of pollen they collected. Alright, so this is a chart showing the difference between the wild bees and the honeybees and the effective size and the distance to the nearest apiary. So the foraging occurrence is shown in blue on the top one, and the nectar foraging success is shown in red on the top one, which is the wild bees. So as you can see, it's pretty high on the foraging success for the wild bees, and it kind of fluctuates for the nectar foraging success for the wild bees as well. In contrast, the honeybees on the bottom, their nectar foraging success is also shown in red, but their pollen foraging success is shown in blue. So they had kind of a lower pollen foraging success than their counterparts, the wild bees, but they seem to have a higher and more consistent nectar foraging success than the wild bees. Alright, so some shortcomings and strengths they had within the manuscript. One shortcoming they had was they had a difficulty tracking the bees and making sure they didn't fly away to a different apiary. They also had troubles making sure the amount of bees was consistent within each apiary location, so when some bees died or something like that happened, something unexpected happened with the amount of bees in each location, they wanted to make sure that the numbers were still consistent between each location. They didn't want there to be an overabundance of wild bees versus an overabundance of honeybees. Everything needed to stay consistent. Alright, and then one strength that they had, they figured out the appropriate amount of bees to place in a single area to maintain pollination rates. So from this, they really can conclude that an overabundance of bees really comes with difficulties, because they will have trouble producing amounts of pollen and honey and pollinating the plants as well. So to maintain the pollination rates, I think that the researchers can conclude that adding the honeybees didn't quite work for them. I don't think that they expected the negative, like as much of a negative impact as it did, but the good thing that we know from this is that adding honeybees to a location just because you think, oh, more bees, more pollen, more honey, more nectar, it's not necessarily a good thing. In fact, it is a bad thing.